The scream of mountain lions had woken Porter Fallen at dawn, but it was the silence an hour later that made him reach for his rifle. Something had disturbed the natural order of his remote homestead in the foothills outside Muskogee, Oklahoma. And in the autumn of 1881, silence meant danger more often than not. He pulled on his boots, running calloused fingers through shoulder-length dark hair still damp from sleep, and stepped out into the crisp October morning. The muscles in his broad shoulders tensed beneath his worn cotton shirt, as he moved with the quiet precision of a man who had survived 6 years alone in these mountains. Porter checked his traps first, then the small corral where his 2 horses stood calm and undisturbed. The chickens scattered at his approach, which meant whatever had caused the unnatural quiet had moved on or was hiding. He made his way toward the woodshed, a sturdy structure he had built with his own hands from pine and oak, positioned against the eastern slope where it stayed dry even in the hardest rains. The door stood slightly ajar, and he could see scuff marks in the dirt that had not been there yesterday. He pushed the door open slowly, rifle ready, and stopped dead in his tracks. A woman lay curled on the floor between stacks of split firewood, her dark auburn hair spread across a bed of wood chips and pine needles. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, was torn at the hem and streaked with mud and what looked like dried blood. Her feet, barely visible beneath her skirts, were wrapped in rags that had soaked through with crimson. She was utterly still, and for a terrible moment Porter thought she was dead. Then her rib cage rose with a shallow breath, and he released the tension he had not realized he was holding. Porter leaned his rifle against the doorframe and knelt beside her, checking first to make sure she was not armed. Her hands were empty, palms scraped raw and blistered. He touched her shoulder gently, and she flinched violently awake, scrambling backward into the woodpile with wide, terrified green eyes. "Easy now," Porter said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You are safe here. I am not going to hurt you." She stared at him, chest heaving, taking in his size and the breadth of his shoulders, the way his muscled arms hung loose at his sides in a posture he hoped conveyed he meant no harm. Her gaze darted to the open door behind him, calculating, and he could see the moment she realized she did not have the strength to run. "Please," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. "Please, I just needed somewhere to rest. I will go. I will leave right now." "You are in no condition to go anywhere," Porter said firmly. He could see now that her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face sunburned and hollow with exhaustion. "When did you last eat?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and her eyes filled with tears that she blinked away furiously. 2 days. Maybe 3. I do not remember." Porter stood slowly, extending his hand to her. "Come up to the cabin. I will get you some food and water, and we can see to those feet." She did not take his hand, but she did manage to pull herself upright using the woodpile for support. When she tried to put weight on her feet, she gasped and would have fallen if Porter had not caught her. The contact seemed to frighten her more than falling would have, and she pushed away from him immediately, gripping the rough wood wall instead. "I can walk," she said, but the trembling in her legs told a different story. "Pride will not get you up that hill," Porter said, not unkindly. "Let me help you." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing her options and finding them all wanting. Finally, she nodded, just barely, and allowed him to slip an arm around her waist. She was lighter than she should have been, all bones and stubborn determination beneath the ruined dress. They made their way slowly up the gentle slope to Porter's cabin, a solid 2-room structure with a stone chimney and real glass windows, luxuries he had earned through years of trapping and trading. He kicked the door open and guided her to the chair nearest the fireplace, where embers from the morning fire still glowed orange in the grate. "Sit," he said, and she obeyed, sinking into the chair with a small sound of relief that she tried to hide. Porter stirred the fire back to life and filled his kettle from the water barrel, hanging it on the hook to heat. Then he cut thick slices of bread from the loaf he had baked 2 days before and spread them with butter and honey. He poured cool water into a tin cup and brought it all to her on a wooden plate. "Drink slow," he warned, "and eat slow, or you will make yourself sick." She took the cup with shaking hands and sipped, then sipped again, her eyes closing in what looked like pure bliss. When she reached for the bread, he noticed the way her fingers trembled, but she heeded his warning and took small, careful bites. Porter gave her space, moving around the cabin to gather what he would need for her feet. Clean cloth for bandages, the tin of salve he made from beeswax and herbs, a basin for washing. He set it all on the table and waited, watching her eat with the single-minded focus of someone who had been too long without. When she had finished the bread and water, some color had returned to her pale cheeks and her hands had steadied. She looked up at him with those striking green eyes and said, "Thank you. I do not know how to repay you." "No repayment needed," Porter said. "But I would like to know your name and how you came to be sleeping in my woodshed." She hesitated, and he saw fear flicker across her face again, but then she squared her shoulders. "My name is Rose Nichols. I walked from the Nichols homestead about 20 miles south of here." Or what used to be the Nichols homestead. Porter pulled up another chair and sat, resting his forearms on his knees. "Used to be." Rose looked down at her ruined hands. "My father died 6 months ago. Fever took him in 3 days. My mother and little brother died 2 years before that, in the winter of '79. It was just me and my father after that, working the land, keeping things going." She paused, swallowing hard. "A man named Samuel Wright has the property adjacent to ours. He wanted our water rights. He made offers, but Pa would not sell. Pa knew what the land would be worth with railroad talk coming through." Porter felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew where this story was going. After Pa died, Wright came around more often, making new offers, then making threats. Rose's voice had gone flat, emotionless, which somehow made it worse. 3 days ago, he told me I had 1 week to marry him or he would take the land anyway. He said a woman alone had no business trying to run a homestead. He said it was not proper." "So you ran," Porter said. "So I ran," Rose confirmed. "In the middle of the night, I took what I could carry, which was not much, and I started walking. I did not know where I was going. I just knew I could not stay there." She looked up at him, and he saw the steel beneath the exhaustion. "I would rather die out here than marry Samuel Wright." Porter felt something fierce and protective rise up in his chest, surprising him with its intensity. He had lived alone for so long, had grown accustomed to his own company and the simplicity of a life without entanglements. But looking at this woman who had walked 20 miles on bleeding feet to escape a forced marriage, he felt something shift inside him. "You will not die," he said firmly, "and you will not marry anyone you do not want to marry. But first, we need to tend to those feet before infection sets in." Rose nodded, and Porter knelt before her chair, carefully lifting her skirts just enough to see the rags wrapped around her feet. When he unwound them, he had to force himself not to react to what he saw. The soles of her feet were blistered and torn, caked with dried blood and dirt. It was a wonder she had made it as far as she had. He brought the basin over and poured warm water into it, then gently lowered her feet into the water. She hissed at the contact, gripping the arms of the chair, but she did not pull away. Porter worked carefully, cleaning away the dirt and blood with steady hands, conscious of her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are very kind," she said softly. I did not expect kindness. You have not had much of it lately, I would guess, Porter replied, drying her feet with a clean cloth. Not lately, no. She was quiet while he applied the salve, his large hands surprisingly gentle. You live up here all alone. 6 years now, Porter said. I came out from Missouri after the war, wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I could work with my hands and not answer to anyone. You were a soldier, for a time. He did not elaborate and she did not press, which he appreciated. He finished wrapping her feet in clean bandages and sat back on his heels. Those need to heal before you do any more walking. You are welcome to stay here until they do. Rose looked startled. I could not possibly impose like that. You do not even know me. I know you walked 20 miles to escape a man who wanted to force you into marriage, Porter said, standing and returning the basin to the counter. I know you would rather face the wilderness alone than lose your freedom. That tells me enough. But people will talk, Rose said, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. An unmarried woman staying in a bachelor's cabin, Porter almost laughed. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away and I see them maybe twice a year. Who exactly is going to talk? She had no answer for that, and after a moment she smiled, just a little. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the exhaustion and fear, and Porter found himself hoping he would see that smile again. Very well, Rose said. I accept your kind offer, but only until my feet heal. And I will help with whatever work I can manage. I am not helpless, despite appearances. I never thought you were helpless, Porter said honestly. Anyone who survives what you survived is far from helpless. The water in the kettle had boiled, and he made tea with herbs from his stores, adding honey to sweeten it. They sat in companionable silence while Rose drank, and Porter found himself studying her more carefully now that the immediate crisis had passed. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 22 or 23 to his 30 years. The structure of her face suggested she had been pretty before hunger and hardship had hollowed her cheeks, and he suspected she would be pretty again once she had a few good meals and some rest. Not that it mattered, Porter told himself firmly. She was a woman in need of help, nothing more. He was simply doing what any decent person would do. But when she looked up and met his eyes, something passed between them that felt like recognition, like two people who had both known loneliness understanding each other without words. Porter looked away first, unsettled by the feeling. You can have the bedroom, he said, standing abruptly. I will sleep out here by the fire. I cannot take your bed, Rose protested. You can and you will. I have slept on far worse than a bedroll by a fire. His tone left no room for argument, and after a moment, Rose nodded. He showed her to the small bedroom, which held a sturdy bed frame he had built himself, a real mattress stuffed with straw and wool, and a chest for storage. It was simple but clean, the quilts on the bed pieced together by hands that knew their work. Did you make these? Rose asked, touching the nearest quilt. My mother, Porter said. She sent them to me when I first moved out here, said even a mountain man needed to keep warm. Rose smiled at that, and Porter felt an odd warmth in his chest. He left her to rest and returned to the main room, standing for a moment in the center of his cabin, and wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. Over the next 3 days, Porter discovered that Rose Nichols was a woman of her word. Despite his protests that she should rest, she insisted on helping where she could, mending his shirts with stitches far neater than his own clumsy attempts, organizing his chaotic pantry, and making meals that reminded him food could be more than just fuel. She moved around the cabin carefully, favoring her injured feet but refusing to be idle. I cannot just sit while you work, she said when he tried to make her rest on the second day. I will go mad. So Porter let her help, and found that he enjoyed the company more than he wanted to admit. Rose was intelligent and quick-witted, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh more in 3 days than he had in the previous 6 months. She asked him about his life in the mountains, about his trapping and hunting, and she listened to his answers with genuine interest. In turn, she told him more about her own life, about growing up on the homestead, learning to work the land alongside her father, about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher from Virginia and had taught Rose to read and write and do figures, about her brother, Jacob, who had been only 8 when the fever took him, and the way her father had never quite been the same after losing his wife and son in the same winter. "He tried his best," Rose said one evening as they sat by the fire, her feet propped up on a cushion while Porter mended a trap. "But I think losing them broke something in him. He went through the motions, but the light had gone out of his eyes. When the fever took him too, part of me was relieved. I felt terrible for thinking it, but he seemed so tired of fighting." "Grief is heavy," Porter said quietly, "and everyone carries it different." "Did you lose someone?" Rose asked, then immediately added, "I am sorry, that is too personal." "My brother," Porter said, surprising himself. He rarely spoke of Marcus. "During the war, he was younger than me by 3 years. I was supposed to watch out for him." He set down the trap, staring into the fire. "He died at Wilson Creek in the first year of fighting. I was not with him when it happened. I have always wondered if I could have made a difference." Rose was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother used to say that wondering what if was a sure path to madness. We can only live the life we have, not the one we might have had." Porter looked at her, this woman who had lost everyone she loved and still found the strength to run 20 miles for her freedom, and felt something in his chest crack open. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Rose said softly. "I wish you could have met her." The moment hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to name. Then the fire popped, breaking the spell, and Porter returned to his mending while Rose picked up the shirt she had been working on. On the 4th day, Porter went out to check his trap line, leaving Rose with strict instructions to rest and not overdo things. He returned in the late afternoon with 2 rabbits and a grouse, to find her standing on the porch in her bare feet, shading her eyes to watch his approach. "You are supposed to be resting those feet," he called as he climbed the slope. "They are much better," Rose called back. "See?" She took a few steps, and while she still moved carefully, the improvement was obvious. "The swelling has gone down and the cuts are starting to close." Porter felt relief and something uncomfortably close to disappointment. If her feet were healing, she would soon be well enough to leave. Which was good, he told himself firmly. She had her own life to get back to, and he had his solitary existence in the mountains. Except Rose did not have a life to get back to, he realized. She had a homestead that Samuel Wright was trying to steal, and no family to help her defend it. That night, after they had eaten the rabbit stewed with wild onions and potatoes, Porter brought up the subject he had been avoiding. "Have you thought about what you are going to do?" he asked. "About your land." Rose's expression closed off, the openness that had been growing between them shuddering like a door swinging shut. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have been trying not to think about it." "You could go to the territorial marshal," Porter suggested. "Report Wright's threats. And tell him what? That Wright made me uncomfortable, that he wanted to marry me." Rose shook her head bitterly. "Wright has money and influence. I am just a woman alone. Who do you think they would believe?" Porter could not argue with that. He had seen enough of the world to know that justice and fairness were not the same thing, and that the latter was in much shorter supply than the former. "You could sell," he said, though the words tasted wrong. "Take what you can get and start fresh somewhere else. Give him exactly what he wants, you mean?" Rose's green eyes flashed. Let him bully me off land my family worked for 15 years, land my mother and brother are buried on. She stood abruptly, pacing the small space of the cabin despite her tender feet. I know it would be the practical thing to do, the smart thing, but I cannot stomach it. I cannot let him win. Porter watched her pace, saw the stubborn set of her jaw and the fierce determination in every line of her body, and made a decision that was probably foolish but felt absolutely right. Then do not let him win, he said. Stay here. Marry me. Rose stopped dead, spinning to face him with her mouth open in shock. What? Porter stood, his heart hammering but his voice steady. Marry me. A married woman has more legal standing than a single one. Right cannot force you into marriage if you are already married to someone else. And with a husband to back your claim, you would have a better chance of holding onto your land. That is insane, Rose said, but she did not immediately refuse, which Porter took as a good sign. Maybe, he agreed, but it would solve your problem. We barely know each other, Rose pointed out. We know each other better than most couples do before they wed, Porter said. And we get along well enough. I have no desire to control you or take what is yours. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more. Even as he said the words, Porter knew they were a lie. What he felt when he looked at Rose Nichols was anything but practical. But he could not say that, not when she was vulnerable and dependent on his help. So he kept his voice level and reasonable, as if he were proposing a business arrangement and not offering her his name and his protection and his heart, whether she wanted it or not. Rose stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You would do that? Marry a woman you met 4 days ago to help her keep her land? Yes, Porter said simply. Why? She asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. What could you possibly get out of this arrangement, company, Porter thought, someone to talk to in the long winter evenings? The sound of your laughter and the sight of your smile, a reason to build something more than just a solitary existence. A wife, he said aloud. Someone to share the work and the cabin. It gets lonely up here sometimes. Rose studied him, and Porter had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his careful reasoning to the truth beneath. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than mocking. And if I said yes, what would you expect from me? As your wife? Porter had thought about this, had turned it over in his mind during the long hours on the trapline. I would expect you to be honest with me, to pull your weight, though I already know you would, to not betray me or make me look the fool. He paused, then added carefully, anything beyond that would be up to you. I am not the kind of man who would force myself on an unwilling woman, practical arrangement or not. Rose's cheeks colored, but she did not look away. That is very decent of you. I try to be a decent man, Porter said. She paced again, worrying at her lower lip with her teeth, and Porter forced himself to stay silent and let her think. This was her decision to make, and he would not pressure her beyond the offer he had already laid out. Finally, Rose stopped and turned to face him. If I agree to this, I want it understood that the land stays in my name. I will not trade one man trying to steal it for another. Agreed, Porter said immediately. I have no interest in your land. I have everything I need right here. And I want to continue managing it myself, making my own decisions about what to plant and when to sell, of course. And if somewhere down the line this arrangement does not work out, we part as friends with no hard feelings. Porter felt a pang at the idea of Rose leaving, but he nodded. Friends, no hard feelings. Rose took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and extended her hand. Then yes, Porter Fallon, I will marry you. Porter took her hand, her small fingers disappearing into his large, calloused palm, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had the strangest sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "We will need to go into Muskogee," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Find a preacher or a judge to make it legal." "How long will it take to get there?" Rose asked. "On horseback, with your feet still healing, we should take it slow. 2 days, maybe 3 if we camp along the way." Rose nodded. "The sooner the better, before Wright realizes where I went and comes looking." The thought of Samuel Wright sent a surge of protective anger through Porter. "If he comes here, he will find himself facing more than he bargained for." Rose smiled, small and genuine. "I believe that." "You are quite formidable when you want to be." Porter felt heat creep up the back of his neck, unused to compliments. "I will start preparing for the trip tomorrow. We can leave the day after if you are up to it." "I will be up to it," Rose said firmly. That night, Porter lay on his bedroll by the fire and stared at the ceiling beams, wondering what he had just done. In the span of a single conversation, he had proposed marriage to a woman he had known for 4 days. It was impulsive and reckless, completely unlike his usual careful, methodical approach to life, but it also felt right in a way he could not quite explain. Rose Nichols had walked into his life bleeding and desperate, and something in him had recognized something in her. A matching loneliness, perhaps. A shared understanding of what it meant to survive when everything else fell apart. Or maybe, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind, "You are just tired of being alone. Tired of talking to yourself and the horses and the mountains that never talk back. Tired of having no one to share the sunset with or wake up beside." Porter rolled over, punching the bedroll into a more comfortable shape, and forced himself to stop thinking. He had made his offer and Rose had accepted. Whatever came next, they would face it together. In the bedroom, Rose lay awake as well, her hands folded over her stomach, staring at the dark ceiling. She should feel terrified, she thought. She was about to marry a man who was essentially a stranger, binding herself legally and spiritually to someone whose last name she had learned only 4 days ago. But instead of terror, what she felt was relief. And beneath the relief, something warmer and more dangerous. Porter Fallon was unlike any man she had ever known. He was quiet and self-contained, but not cold. Strong, clearly, with muscles that spoke of hard physical labor and a life spent outdoors. But his strength did not frighten her the way Samuel Wright's had. Porter used his strength to protect, not to intimidate, and there was kindness in him. She had seen it in the way he tended her feet, in the patience with which he listened to her stories, in his offer to marry her without expecting anything in return. Rose rolled onto her side, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She would not let herself hope for more than the practical arrangement they had agreed to. She had learned the hard way that hope could be a dangerous thing, setting you up for disappointment when life inevitably fell short. But still, as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking about the way Porter's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and the rumble of his laugh, and the safety she felt in his presence. They spent the next day preparing for the journey. Porter checked over his horses, 2 sturdy mountain-bred animals named Salt and Pepper for their coloring, and assembled supplies for the trip. Rose packed what few belongings she had and helped prepare food they could eat on the trail. As she worked, Rose found herself watching Porter move around the homestead, the easy competence with which he handled every task. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of heavy muscle that came from years of physical labor. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves that he sometimes tied back with a leather cord, and his hands were scarred and calloused, but surprisingly gentle when they needed to be. She caught herself staring more than once and forced her attention back to her own work, feeling foolish. This was a practical arrangement, she reminded herself. Porter was helping her because he was a good man, not because he felt anything particular for her. But that night, as they shared dinner, Porter said, "You know, I do not even know how old you are." Rose smiled. 23. "I will be 24 in December. And you?" 30 as of last June, Porter said. "So I am not so old that people will talk about that, at least." "Are you worried about what people will think?" Rose asked, genuinely curious. Porter shrugged. "Not especially. But I would not want anyone thinking I took advantage of you." "No one who knows the truth could think that," Rose said firmly. "You have been nothing but honorable." Porter looked pleased by that, and they fell into comfortable conversation about the route they would take to Muskogee and what they would need to do once they arrived. They set out the next morning, Rose riding behind Porter on Salt while Pepper carried their supplies. Rose's feet were still tender, but the bandages Porter had fashioned held well, and the salve continued to work its healing magic. The ride down from the mountains was beautiful, autumn colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Porter pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the area, about the Cherokee who had once lived here before being driven west, about the outlaws who sometimes hid in the deeper mountains, about the wildlife that called these hills home. Rose found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey, her arms wrapped around Porter's waist for balance. She could feel the solid warmth of him through his shirt, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It should have felt awkward, being so close to a man she barely knew, but instead it felt natural, like something they had done 100 times before. They made camp that evening beside a creek, and Porter showed Rose how to set up the simple canvas shelter he had brought. They ate hardtack and jerky and apples from Porter's stores and sat by the fire watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked quietly. "Living so far from everything and everyone?" Porter considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When the winters get long and the silence gets heavy. But then spring comes and I remember why I chose this, the freedom of it, the peace. No one telling me what to do or who to be." He glanced at her. "Do you think you will regret marrying me?" "I do not know," Rose said honestly. "Ask me again in a year." Porter laughed at that, and the sound echoed across the water. "Fair enough." They reached Muskogee on the afternoon of the second day, riding into town along dusty streets lined with wooden buildings. The town was bigger than Rose had expected, with a proper main street, a hotel, several saloons, a general store, and a church with a white steeple. Porter led them to a modest boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Henderson, a round-faced widow who eyed them with obvious curiosity but asked no prying questions when Porter requested 2 rooms. "We are here to be married," Porter explained. "We will need the rooms for tonight, and then we will be heading back tomorrow." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Well, congratulations to you both. The Reverend Collins at the church can perform the ceremony. He is usually available in the afternoons." After settling the horses at the livery and washing off the trail dust, Porter and Rose made their way to the church. Reverend Collins turned out to be a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair. He listened to their story with a thoughtful expression, then said, "I am happy to perform the ceremony, but I must ask, are you both entering into this marriage of your own free will?" "Yes," Rose said firmly, "and you understand this is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly or dissolved on a whim." Rose and Porter looked at each other, and Rose saw her own seriousness reflected in his dark eyes. "We understand," Porter said. "Very well. Do you have witnesses?" They did not, but the Reverend called in Mrs. Collins and the church secretary, a young man named Timothy. The ceremony was brief and simple, the words familiar from 100 weddings Rose had attended over the years, but somehow they felt different when applied to her own life. Porter produced a simple gold band, and Rose wondered when he had acquired it, until she saw the paler band of skin on his own right hand, and realized he had given her a ring that had belonged to someone in his family. The gesture touched her more than she wanted to admit. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Porter leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Hello, Mrs. Fallen," he murmured, and Rose felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Hello, Mr. Fallen," she replied, and saw the corner of his mouth quirk up in a smile. They signed the marriage certificate and received their copy legal proof of their union. As they walked back to the boarding house in the golden light of late afternoon, Rose felt as if she were walking through a dream. 24 hours ago she had been Rose Nichols, alone and uncertain. Now she was Rose Fallen, wife to a mountain man she had known for less than a week. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something that might have been hope. That evening they ate dinner in the boarding house dining room, a surprisingly good meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. Other boarders cast curious glances their way, but no one bothered them, and Rose was grateful for the privacy. As they were finishing their meal, a man entered the dining room, and Rose felt her entire body go rigid. Porter noticed immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "What is it?" he asked quietly. "That is him," Rose whispered. "Samuel Wright." Porter followed her gaze to the tall, well-dressed man who had just seated himself across the room. Wright was handsome in a cold, calculating way, with pale blue eyes and hair slicked back with pomade. He was scanning the room, and Rose knew the moment he spotted her, because his eyes widened, and then narrowed with fury. He stood and strode toward their table, and Porter rose to meet him, positioning himself between Wright and Rose. The difference between the two men was striking. Wright was tall and lean, dressed in expensive clothes that spoke of wealth and position. Porter was taller and far broader, his simple shirt and trousers well worn but clean, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready. "Rose Nichols," Wright said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I have been looking everywhere for you." "It is Rose Fallen now," Porter said, his voice a low rumble. "And I would appreciate you keeping your distance from my wife." Wright's gaze snapped to Porter, taking in his size and the quiet authority in his stance. "Your wife? That is impossible. She was unmarried 3 days ago." "Not anymore," Rose said, standing and moving to Porter's side. She held up her left hand, showing the gold band on her finger. "We were married this afternoon by Reverend Collins. It is all quite legal, I assure you." Wright's face flushed an ugly red. "This is ridiculous. You ran away like a thief in the night and married the first man you found. Have you lost your mind?" "I ran away from you," Rose said coldly. "And I married a good man who treats me with respect, something you never understood." "I offered you everything," Wright hissed. "A good home, financial security, a respectable position in society. And you threw it back in my face." "You offered me a prison," Rose shot back, "and a husband who saw me as property to be acquired, not a person to be respected." Wright's hand moved, and for a moment Rose thought he might actually strike her. But Porter stepped forward, and something in his expression made Wright freeze. "Touch her and you will regret it," Porter said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. "She is my wife now, and I protect what is mine." Wright sneered. "I should have known. She always was too willful for her own good, but you have made a mistake, Rose. That land is wasted on you. You have no idea how to manage it, no resources to develop it properly. And without my protection, you will lose it within a year." "Then I will lose it," Rose said, "but it will be my choice, not yours, and I would rather fail on my own terms than succeed on yours." Wright stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You are a fool, both of you. But I wash my hands of this. When you come crawling back, begging for help, do not expect any mercy from me." He turned and stalked out of the dining room, and Rose found herself shaking with reaction. Porter's hand came to rest on her shoulder, steady and warm, and she leaned into him without thinking. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," Rose said, and realized it was true. "Yes, I am all right, better than all right. I am free of him." Porter smiled down at her, and Rose saw pride in his eyes. "You handled that well." "So did you," Rose said. "Thank you for standing with me." "Always," Porter said, and the word felt like a promise. They left Muskogee the next morning, both of them eager to put the town and Samuel right behind them. The ride back to the mountains felt different than the ride down. Rose was more relaxed now, the weight of uncertainty lifted from her shoulders. She was married, legally bound to a man who seemed to genuinely care for her well-being, and Wright could no longer threaten her with forced marriage. As they rode, Porter told her more about his life in the mountains, about the rhythms of the seasons and the work that filled his days. Rose listened and asked questions, and they talked about how to manage both the mountain homestead and Rose's land down in the valley. "I will need to go back eventually," Rose said, "to see what condition the house is in and to work the land. Spring planting will be here before we know it." "We will go together," Porter said. "I am not letting you face Wright alone again." Rose felt warmth spread through her chest at the casual certainty in his voice. "You would leave your homestead to help me with mine. We are married," Porter pointed out. "What is yours is ours now, practical arrangement or not. Besides," he added with a smile, "I have always been curious about farming. Trapping and hunting only take you so far." They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Porter helped Rose down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she found herself not minding at all. Over the following weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. Rose continued to recover, her feet healing completely, and she threw herself into helping with the work of the homestead. She learned to set snares and check trap lines, to recognize the signs of different animals, to move quietly through the forest. Porter, in turn, learned from her about preserving food and managing stores, about the thousand small efficiencies that made a household run smoothly. They worked well together, Rose discovered. Porter was patient and thorough, never dismissive of her questions or ideas. And when she made a mistake, he showed her how to do it better without making her feel foolish. In return, Rose brought organization and planning to Porter's previously haphazard approach to household management. But it was the evenings Rose treasured most. After the work was done and they had eaten, they would sit by the fire and talk. Porter told her about growing up in Missouri, about his family and his brother and the war that had changed everything. Rose shared memories of her own childhood, of her mother's stories and her father's quiet strength. Gradually, almost without noticing, the space between them on the bench by the fire grew smaller. Porter's arm would rest along the back, not quite touching her shoulders but close enough that Rose could feel his warmth. Rose would lean in when he spoke, drawn to the deep rumble of his voice. One evening in late November, as the first snow of the season fell outside, Porter said, "I have been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," Rose teased, and he huffed a laugh. "Maybe, but hear me out." He turned to face her more fully. "Winter is coming on hard, and the trail down to your land will be impassable soon. I think we should plan to stay here through the winter, and come spring, we can go down together to assess the damage and start planting." Rose nodded slowly. "That makes sense. But what about your trapping? Will not you lose the season?" "I can still trap here in the mountains," Porter said, "and having you here to help with the other work means I can cover more ground. Besides," he added, his voice softening, "I would rather have you safe here than risk you getting caught in a blizzard trying to reach the valley." "You worry about me," Rose said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," Porter admitted. "I do. Is that so strange?" "No," Rose said softly. "It has just been a long time since anyone worried about me." Their eyes met, and Rose felt her breath catch. In the flickering firelight, Porter's face was all planes and shadows, strong and handsome and achingly gentle. She saw the moment he started to lean toward her, saw the question in his eyes, and she answered it by closing the distance between them herself. The kiss was soft and tentative, a question rather than a demand. Porter's lips were warm against hers, and his hand came up to cup her cheek with infinite care, as if she were something precious that might break. Rose leaned into him, her hand resting on his chest where she could feel the steady thunder of his heart. When they pulled apart, Porter rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I know," Rose said, smiling. "I have wanted you to." "This practical arrangement is not feeling very practical anymore," Porter said, and there was warmth and humor in his voice. "No," Rose agreed. "It is not." "Is that all right with you?" Porter asked, and Rose loved him a little for asking, for making sure this was what she wanted. "It is more than all right," she said, and kissed him again. That night marked a turning point. They were still careful with each other, still navigating the newness of this deepening relationship, but the wall between them had come down. Porter no longer slept by the fire but shared the bed with Rose, holding her close through the cold nights, his solid presence a comfort and a joy. Winter settled over the mountains in earnest, bringing snow and ice and the kind of cold that burned the lungs. But inside the cabin, wrapped in quilts in each other's arms, Rose had never felt warmer. Porter was an attentive lover, patient and careful, always making sure she was comfortable and willing. And Rose, who had spent so long afraid of the future, found herself looking forward to each new day. They celebrated Christmas simply, with a wreath of pine boughs over the door and a special dinner of roasted venison. Porter surprised Rose with a gift, a beautifully carved wooden box with a fitted lid. "I made it for you," he said, looking almost shy. "I thought you could use it for your mother's things, the letters and such that you talked about." Rose traced the intricate pattern carved into the lid, her eyes stinging with tears. "It is beautiful, Porter, thank you. It is your birthday soon, too," Porter said. "December 22nd, right?" "I did not forget." On her birthday, Porter woke her before dawn and bundled her into warm clothes. "I want to show you something," he said, and led her out into the pre-dawn darkness. They climbed to a rocky outcropping above the cabin, and Porter wrapped his arms around her from behind as they watched the sun rise over the snow-covered mountains. The sky blazed with color, pink and gold and purple, and the world was so beautiful it hurt. "I used to come up here when I was feeling lonely," Porter said quietly. "Watching the sun rise reminded me that no matter how dark things got, there was always light coming, always a new day." He turned her in his arms so she faced him. "But I have not been lonely since you came." "You brought the light with you, Rose." Rose reached up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "I love you, Porter Fallen. I did not plan to. This was supposed to be practical, but I cannot help it. I love you." Porter's smile was like the sunrise, brilliant and warm and full of promise. "I love you too. Have since the first week, I think. Maybe since the first day. You were so fierce and brave, sleeping in my woodshed with your feet bleeding and your pride intact. How could I not love you?" They kissed there on the mountain as the sun rose around them, and Rose felt happiness settle into her bones. She had walked 20 miles to escape one future and found another, better one waiting in a woodshed. Life, she thought, was strange and wonderful and absolutely unpredictable. Winter passed in a blur of quiet contentment. Porter taught Rose to shoot, and she became a decent shot with both rifle and pistol. Rose taught Porter to read better than he had before, sharing her mother's books and reading aloud to him in the evenings. They worked together, laughed together, made love and made plans for the future. When spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the world green again, they prepared to make the journey down to Rose's land. Porter had been thinking about the logistics all winter, and he had a plan. "We will spend the growing season down there," he said. "Get the fields planted and the house repaired. Then in the fall, after harvest, we can decide where we want to spend the winter. We can split our time between the two places, work both homesteads." "That is a lot of traveling back and forth," Rose pointed out. "I know, but I think we can make it work." Porter pulled her close. "Besides, I go where you go. We are in this together now." The journey down the mountain was easier than Rose's desperate flight up it had been. They rode together on Salt, with Pepper carrying supplies and tools for repairing the house. As they descended into the valley, Rose felt nervousness twist in her stomach. What would they find? Had Wright made good on his implicit threats and vandalized her property? But when they arrived at the Nichols homestead, Rose was relieved to find it largely intact. The house needed work, the fields were overgrown, and the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, but it was all fixable. Porter walked the property with her, making mental notes of what needed to be done, and Rose felt gratitude and love swell in her chest. He had not hesitated for even a moment. Her problems were his problems, her home was his home. They spent that first day cleaning out the house, airing out rooms that had been closed up for months, sweeping away dust and cobwebs. Rose showed Porter the graves of her mother and brother, two simple markers in the plot behind the house, and they stood together in silence, paying respects. "Your father is not buried here?" Porter asked gently. "No," Rose said. "He wanted to be buried next to his first wife back in Virginia. I did not have the money or the means to take him there, so he is in the town cemetery in Muskogee." She swallowed hard. "I feel guilty about that sometimes. Like I failed him." "You did not fail him," Porter said firmly. "You did the best you could in an impossible situation. He would understand that." Over the following weeks they worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the house and preparing the fields. Porter's strength and skill made work that would have taken Rose all summer alone go much faster. He fixed the barn, repaired the plow, and helped her plant corn and beans and squash in the fields her father had cleared. Word got around that Rose was back and that she had a husband now. Neighbors Rose had not seen in months came by to welcome them, curious about the tall, quiet mountain man who had married her. Porter was polite but reserved, and Rose could see him struggling with being around so many people after years of solitude. "You are doing fine," she whispered to him one evening after a neighbor couple had left. "I know this is a lot for you." "It is different," Porter admitted, "but I will adjust. For you, I will adjust to anything." Samuel Wright stayed away, which Rose considered a blessing. She heard through the neighbors that he had been courting a widow from Fort Smith, and seemed to have given up on acquiring the Nichols land through marriage. Rose hoped that meant he had given up on it entirely, but she was not naive enough to believe it completely. Summer arrived hot and humid, so different from the cool mountains Porter was used to. He spent hours in the fields, his skin turning bronze under the relentless sun, his muscles standing out in sharp relief as he worked. Rose tried not to stare, but sometimes she could not help it. Her husband was a beautiful man, and knowing he was hers still felt like a miracle. One afternoon in late July, Rose realized she had not had her monthly courses in quite some time. She counted back and felt her heart skip. 2 months, maybe more. She had been so busy with the work of the homestead that she had not paid attention, but now that she thought about it, there were other signs. The tenderness in her breasts, the way certain smells made her queasy in the mornings, the bone-deep exhaustion that plagued her even after a full night's sleep. She was pregnant. She was going to have Porter's child. Rose sat down abruptly on the porch steps, her hand going to her still flat stomach. A baby. Their baby. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. They had only been married 7 months. Was it too soon? Would Porter be happy about this? That evening, after they had eaten dinner and were sitting on the porch watching the fireflies, Rose gathered her courage. "Porter, I need to tell you something." He turned to her immediately, concern creasing his forehead. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Rose said quickly. "More than fine. I am just nervous about how you will react." She took a deep breath. "I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Porter stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Rose's heart sank. Then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face, transforming it. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Rose said, smiling now too. "Sometime in early spring, I think." Porter let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the barn and pulled Rose into his arms, lifting her clean off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, he was laughing, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I am going to be a father," he said, awe in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Rose asked, even though the answer was written all over his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Porter said. He knelt down so he was eye level with her stomach and placed his large hand gently over where their child grew. "Hello in there, little one. This is your pa. I cannot wait to meet you." Rose ran her fingers through Porter's hair, overcome with love. "You are going to be a wonderful father." "I am going to try," Porter said, standing and pulling her close again. "I am going to try so hard, Rose, to be the father this baby deserves, to be the husband you deserve." "You already are," Rose said, and meant it with her whole heart. The knowledge of the baby changed things, made them both more conscious of the future they were building together. Porter became even more protective, insisting Rose not overwork herself, taking on extra tasks so she could rest. Rose tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding it came from a place of love. As summer turned to fall, they brought in the harvest, a good yield that would see them through the winter and provide surplus to sell. Porter suggested they spend the winter at the Valley homestead, so Rose would not have to make the difficult journey up the mountain in her condition. "We can go back to the cabin in the spring," he said. "After the baby is born and you have recovered, I will make sure both places are ready for us." Rose agreed, grateful for his thoughtfulness. As the weather cooled, they prepared the valley house for winter, stocking the pantry and cutting wood for the fireplace. Porter made improvements to the house, adding a room that could serve as a nursery and reinforcing the walls against the winter winds. On a cold day in November, a year almost to the day since Rose had stumbled into Porter's woodshed, a rider came up the lane to the house. Porter saw him first and called Rose inside, his hand moving to the rifle by the door, but the rider was not Samuel Wright. It was the territorial marshal, a weathered man named Carlson who Rose had met once or twice in town. "Mrs. Fallon," Carlson said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Fallon. I apologize for the intrusion." "What can we do for you, Marshal?" Porter asked, not quite relaxing. "I wanted to inform you that Samuel Wright has left the territory," Carlson said. "Sold his land and moved back east. Seems his investments did not pan out the way he hoped, and he decided to cut his losses." Rose felt a weight she had not realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. "He is gone, truly gone." Yes, madam. I thought you would want to know given the history. Carlson glanced at Porter. I also wanted to say I am sorry I did not take your concerns more seriously when you came to me before, Mrs. Fallon. Before you married. You were right that Wright was not a good man. I should have listened. Thank you, Marshal, Rose said quietly. I appreciate you coming all this way to tell us. After Carlson left, Rose turned to Porter and buried her face in his chest. He held her tight, one hand cradling the back of her head. It is over, Porter murmured. He is gone. He cannot hurt you any more. I know, Rose said. I know, I just needed a moment. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, wrapped around each other, and Rose felt the last lingering shadow of fear dissipate. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. Winter settled in, but it was gentler in the valley than it would have been in the mountains. Rose's pregnancy advanced, her belly growing round and full. Porter was endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body, by the movement of the baby they could sometimes see rippling across her skin. Strong little thing, he said one night, his hand resting on her stomach as the baby kicked. Takes after the mother. Or the father, Rose countered. You are not exactly known for being delicate. Porter laughed and kissed her, careful and tender. He treated her like spun glass now, always afraid of hurting her or the baby, and Rose had to remind him constantly that she was not fragile. The baby came on a cold March morning, after a night of labor that tested Rose's strength and Porter's nerves. Porter stayed with her through it all, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation in the first place. When the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Rose's arms, Porter's face was wet with tears. A boy, the midwife announced. A big, healthy boy. Rose looked down at her son, at his tiny fists and scrunched-up face, and felt her heart expand to accommodate a love so vast it threatened to overwhelm her. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Porter reached out a tentative finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Porter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Marcus after Porter's brother and Jacob for Rose's. Marcus Jacob Fallon, a name that honored the past while looking toward the future. Porter was a devoted father from the first moment, learning to change diapers and soothe crying Jags, walking the floor with Marcus in the middle of the night when Rose was too exhausted to move. Watching her huge, strong husband cradle their tiny son with infinite gentleness made Rose fall in love with him all over again. As spring progressed and Rose recovered her strength, they made plans to return to the mountain cabin for the summer. Rose was nervous about making the journey with an infant, but Porter assured her they would take it slow and stop as often as needed. "I want him to know both places," Porter said. "The mountains and the valley. I want him to understand the different kinds of life we can live, and someday he can choose which he prefers." "We are very lucky," Rose said, watching Marcus sleep in his cradle, "to have choices, to have each other." "I am the lucky one," Porter said, pulling her close. "You walked into my life and changed everything, made me remember what it was like to hope for more than just survival." They returned to the mountains in May, the journey taking twice as long as it usually would with frequent stops to feed and change Marcus. But Porter was patient, and eventually they crested the final ridge and saw the cabin nestled in its clearing, exactly as they had left it. "Home," Rose said, and realized she meant both places. Wherever Porter was, wherever their family was, that was home. The years that followed were full and rich. They split their time between the mountain cabin and the valley homestead, raising Marcus and, eventually, his siblings. 2 years after Marcus came Emma, a fierce little girl with her mother's red hair and her father's dark eyes. 3 years after that came Samuel, named for no one in particular but chosen because they simply liked the name. Porter proved to be everything Rose had known he would be as a father. Patient and kind, firm when necessary, always ready with a story or a game or a strong shoulder to lean on. He taught the children to ride and hunt and track, to respect the land and the animals that shared it with them. Rose taught them to read and write and do figures, passing on her mother's love of learning. She told them stories of their grandparents, keeping those memories alive, and she made sure they understood the value of hard work and independence. Marcus grew tall and strong like his father, with a quiet competence that made Porter burst with pride. Emma was bold and adventurous, fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. Samuel was the gentle one, more interested in books and growing things than hunting, but no less loved for his differences. The Valley homestead prospered under their combined efforts, producing enough crops to sell and trade, building a solid financial foundation. Porter's trapping business continued as well, providing furs and pelts that fetched good prices in town. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The love that had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into something deep and abiding, the kind of partnership that weathered storms and celebrated sunshine in equal measure. On their 10th anniversary, Porter took Rose back to the rocky outcropping above the mountain cabin where he had told her he loved her all those years ago. The children were old enough now to be left with neighbors for a day, and Porter wanted to give Rose a gift. They watched the sun rise together, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been so many times before, and Porter pulled out a small wooden box. "I made you something," he said, handing it to her. Rose opened it to find a delicate wooden carving of a woman walking, her skirts swirling around her legs, her face turned toward the horizon. "It is me," she said, wonder in her voice. "It is you the night you walked 20 miles to find your freedom," Porter said. "I carved it so we would never forget how brave you were, how strong. You walked into the unknown rather than accept a life you did not want, and I am grateful every single day that you ended up in my woodshed." Rose traced the carving with gentle fingers, her eyes bright with tears. "I walked 20 miles and found everything I did not know I was looking for. I found you. I found home. I found forever." Porter pulled her close, and they kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life neither of them could have imagined. Below them, the cabin stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney where the fire still burned. Further away, the Valley homestead waited, fields green with new growth, the house filled with the echoes of children's laughter. Two homes, one family, and a love that had started with a desperate woman sleeping in a woodshed and a mountain man with a kind heart. It was not the life either of them had planned, but it was better than anything they could have dreamed. Rose Fallon rested her head on her husband's broad shoulder and watched the sun continue its climb into the sky, feeling grateful for every twist of fate that had led her to this moment. She had walked into the wilderness alone and afraid, and she had found her way to a man who had given her everything she needed and so much more than she had ever dared to want. Forever, she thought, was a long time, but with Porter by her side, it did not seem long enough. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. The children grew, and the homesteads prospered, and Porter and Rose grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. When Marcus turned 18, he announced his intention to start his own homestead further into the mountains, following in his father's footsteps. Porter helped him build his cabin, teaching him everything he had learned over the years, and Rose sent him off with quilts and supplies and a mother's blessing. Emma, at 16, shocked them all by declaring she wanted to become a teacher like her grandmother had been. Rose found her a position with a family in town who needed a governess, and Emma thrived, coming home on weekends with stories of her students and dreams of opening her own school someday. Samuel stayed closer to home, taking over the management of the Valley homestead, and showing a gift for farming that surpassed even his parents' abilities. Under his careful stewardship, the land produced better yields than ever, and he invested the profits wisely, buying adjacent parcels and slowly expanding the family's holdings. Porter and Rose, with the children grown and independent, found themselves with time they had not had in years. They spent long, lazy summers at the mountain cabin, just the two of them like in the early days, and winters at the valley house where they could be near Samuel and help with the work when needed. They grew old together gracefully, Porter's dark hair turning silver, Rose's auburn fading to a soft rose gold. Porter's hands developed arthritis from years of hard work, but they were still gentle when they touched his wife. Rose's eyes needed spectacles for reading now, but they still lit up when she looked at Porter. On their 25th anniversary, their children organized a celebration, bringing together friends and neighbors from both the mountains and the valley. It was a boisterous, joyful affair, with food and music and dancing that went on into the night. At one point, Porter pulled Rose aside, leading her away from the noise and the crowd to a quiet spot beneath the stars. "You remember when I asked you to marry me?" he said, his arm around her waist. "I told you it would be a practical arrangement, that we would be companions, nothing more." Rose laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I had ever met or completely insane." "Probably both," Porter admitted with a grin. "But I am glad you said yes. I am glad you took a chance on a lonely mountain man." "I am glad I stumbled into your woodshed," Rose said. "Although I have to say, of all the places I could have chosen to collapse from exhaustion, that was probably the best one." They stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of celebration drifting through the night. After a moment, Rose said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked in a different direction that night? If I had never found your cabin?" "Sometimes," Porter admitted. "But then I remember that you were walking toward freedom, and I was waiting without knowing I was waiting. I think we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." "That is very romantic for a practical man," Rose teased. "You bring out the romantic in me," Porter said, and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of the love that had sustained them through 2.5 decades of life together. More years passed, and Porter's health began to decline. The arthritis worsened, and his lungs, damaged by years of breathing cold mountain air, grew weak. Rose cared for him with the same fierce determination she had brought to everything else in her life, refusing to let him slip away without a fight. But on a quiet spring morning, with Rose holding his hand and the window open to let in the scent of apple blossoms, Porter closed his eyes for the last time. "I love you," Rose whispered, her tears falling on their joined hands. "I love you, and I will see you again." Porter's funeral was attended by everyone whose life he had touched over the years. Marcus spoke of his father's strength and kindness, Emma of his wisdom and patience, Samuel of his quiet courage. Rose listened to her children celebrate their father's life and felt grief and gratitude war in her chest. She buried him in the mountains he had loved, in a plot beside the cabin where they had spent so many happy years. The marker was simple, just his name and the dates of his life, but Rose planted wildflowers around it, flowers that would bloom every spring and summer, a riot of color to mark where he rested. For a time, Rose did not know what to do with herself. The shape of her life had been built around Porter for so long that his absence left a void nothing seemed able to fill. But slowly, with the support of her children and the memory of Porter's voice telling her to be brave, Rose found her way forward. She spent her remaining years splitting her time between her children, helping Marcus with his growing family, assisting Emma with her school, supporting Samuel in his farming ventures. She told stories of Porter to her grandchildren, making sure they knew the man their grandfather had been. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Rose would sit on the porch of the mountain cabin and look out over the land she and Porter had built a life on, and she would feel his presence beside her, as real as it had been when he was alive. Rose lived to see 72 years, far longer than many women of her generation. When her time came, she went peacefully in her sleep, with Emma holding one hand and Samuel the other, Marcus keeping vigil at the foot of her bed. They buried her beside Porter, under the wildflowers and the wide Montana sky, two markers standing side by side for two people who had found each other against all odds and loved each other with everything they had. The mountain cabin still stands, passed down through the generations, a testament to the man who built it and the woman who made it a home. The Valley homestead thrives under the stewardship of Rose and Porter's descendants, the land their family died to protect now flourishing and productive. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the mountains, people swear they can hear laughter, the sound of two voices raised in joy and love, echoing across the years. Some say it is just the wind, but those who know the story of the mountain man and the woman who slept in his woodshed know better. It is the sound of forever, of a love that began with an act of desperation and grew into something that death itself could not diminish. It is the sound of two souls who found each other when they needed it most and held on tight, building a life and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Rose walked 20 miles seeking freedom and found so much more. She found love, partnership, family, and a home in the heart of a man who had given up on hoping for such things. And Porter, the lonely mountain man, found that the greatest treasure was not gold or furs or land, but the woman who stumbled into his woodshed and changed his life forever. Their story became legend in the mountains and valleys of Oklahoma, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when it was built on respect, trust, and genuine partnership. Young couples would visit their graves, laying flowers and making wishes, hoping some of that legendary love would bless their own unions. Marcus Fallen, in his later years, wrote down his parents' story as they had told it to him, preserving the details for future generations. The manuscript was carefully maintained by the family, each generation adding their own chapter to the ongoing saga of the fallen family. Emma's school grew into an institution that educated hundreds of children over the decades, and she made sure every student learned about strong women like her mother who refused to let circumstances define their fate. The scholarship she established in Rose's name helped countless young women receive educations they otherwise could not have afforded. Samuel's farming innovations turned the Valley homestead into one of the most productive properties in the territory, and later the state, when Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907. The techniques he developed were shared freely with neighboring farmers, spreading prosperity through the region, and cementing the fallen name as one associated with generosity and community. The wooden carving Porter had made of Rose walking toward her freedom became a cherished family heirloom, passed to the eldest daughter in each generation along with the story of the night Rose had walked 20 miles on bleeding feet, rather than surrender her autonomy. It served as a reminder that courage sometimes meant walking into the unknown, trusting that somewhere ahead was something better than what you were leaving behind. The marriage certificate, yellowed and fragile with age, was framed and hung in the Valley house, a testament to the moment two practical people entered into an arrangement that became the foundation of a love story for the ages. Visitors would study the simple document and marvel that something so bureaucratic could represent something so profound. Years turned into decades, and decades into a century, and still the story of Porter and Rose endured. Great-great-grandchildren who never knew them still spoke their names with reverence, still visited the mountain cabin maintained as a family landmark, still laid flowers on two graves that rested side by side beneath eternal wildflowers. The woodshed where Rose had first sought shelter was eventually replaced, the old wood rotting despite Porter's excellent craftsmanship. But the new woodshed was built in exactly the same spot, and a small plaque was mounted on the door. Here, Rose found shelter. Here, two souls found each other. The story of the mountain man and the woman in the woodshed became more than just a family tale. It became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost, alone, or desperate. It reminded people that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to our greatest blessings, if we are brave enough to walk through them. And in the mountains of Oklahoma, where the wind still whispers through the pines and the wildflowers still bloom every spring, the legacy of Porter and Rose Fallen lives on, a testament to the transformative power of kindness, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring nature of love freely given and gratefully received. Their story reminds us that forever is not just a measure of time but a quality of connection, that home is not just a place but the presence of someone who sees you truly and loves you completely, and that sometimes the most practical decision we can make is to follow our hearts into the unknown and trust that love will light the way. Porter gave Rose forever when he offered her his name and his protection. Rose gave Porter forever when she accepted, bringing light and laughter back into a life that had grown too quiet and too lonely. Together, they built a forever that outlasted their mortal years, living on in the land they worked, the children they raised, and the love story they created out of desperation, kindness, and hope. In the end, Rose had walked 20 miles and found everything. Porter had opened his door and his heart, and discovered that forever was not something you stumbled upon but something you built, one day, one choice, one act of love at a time. And that forever, once built, could withstand anything time threw at it, enduring long after the last breath was drawn and the final sunset watched. This is the story of how a mountain man found a woman sleeping in his woodshed and gave her forever. But more than that, it is the story of how two people found each other in the wilderness and built something that would last for generations, a love that would become legend, a forever that truly meant forever.